Good morning and welcome to Coffee and Conversation with David Cattler. Please welcome INSA Vice President John Doyon.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for Coffee and Conversation. This morning, we are pleased to welcome one of our community's top leaders to our program. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have questions, and we hope you do, please submit them through the questions box on the right side of your screen, and we'll do our best to get to all of your questions. We are pleased as well to welcome members of the press to the call today, and this is a reminder that this program is on the record. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker. David Cattler is the Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Security at NATO. In this capacity, he ensures NATO intelligence organizations operate as an enterprise to meet the challenging demands of the alliance. He's also the Senior Advisor to the Secretary General for Intelligence and Security Matters. Mr. Cattler is the first American selected to serve in this position, which was created in 2016. Previously, he was a senior national and defense intelligence official here in the United States. Mr. Cattler served multiple times as an intelligence enterprise mission manager and led complex efforts across organizational and functional boundaries. He has significant collection management and analytic experience at the national, joint, and service levels, and has advised the President, civilian agencies, Defense Department and military leaders, and operational forces. David, thank you for joining us today and welcome. And sorry we didn't get your camera up and running, but I know we'll be able to hear you just fine and look forward to this conversation.
Yeah, sounds good. And thanks, John. I really appreciate the invitation to join you this morning. I wish I was in Washington to be there with you, but I do have a cup of coffee in my hand, and Brussels today feels like we're on the surface of the sun.
Oh, I know. I was, the heat wave is incredible. I think you guys are over 100 degrees there today. So I hope you can stay cool while we have this conversation. Lots to talk about, but just before we jump into things, can you provide us just a few bits of information about your position at NATO and the duties and responsibilities of your position?
Yeah, thanks. So as you said in the introduction, I'm the Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Security. So as such, on the SecGen's senior staff. And I'd say at a high level, I have really three roles here. The first is to ensure that the security here is really top-notch and that the security standards are met completely. But within that, I think really importantly from my portfolio's perspective, that we meet the expectations of the nation's intelligence and security services with regards to how their data and personnel must be protected. The second task is to ensure that the allies get what we say at 30, so meaning all 30 nations simultaneously, get the same intelligence-driven insights and advice. And then finally, to constantly work to raise their level of knowledge on any of the issues that they wish to consider and take political and military decisions about. I'd say in many ways, it's a lot like my experience within the US intelligence community in many regards. And if you consider that the 30 nations and their 75 or so intelligence and security services are about the same as us within the US with all of our agencies within the USIC, it's a lot of the same interaction and balancing between them for what they need and what they choose to contribute on any given day.
Great. Well, let's jump into questions. I know a lot of people are here, of course, concerns and interest in the Ukraine and the Russia war. And it's devastating as an effect that Putin's war in Ukraine has had. The event in some ways has only strengthened the NATO alliance. So I wanted to ask you about this and I'll get your views on that and ask you, what do you see as the outlook for the alliance and the challenges ahead, especially as the war continues now into its 5th month? Do you believe Putin miscalculated and underestimated the strength of NATO?
Well, thanks, John. I think it's important to remind up front that NATO as an alliance and its allies had prepared for this possibility for quite some time. We didn't just realize on the 24th of February that there was a danger coming to Ukraine and to Euro-Atlantic security, and that Russia was dangerous. And we put a lot of effort in to try to provide strategic warning and operational warning. And in many ways, I think we were very successful in all that work. Some allies you saw even shared some related intelligence reports publicly last fall and accurately foresaw that Russia was building up and planned to invade Ukraine, and also warned of some specific things like potential false flag operations, potential subversion of President Zelensky's government, the potential use of chemical weapons, and so on. And of course, NATO and its members worked very hard all the way to the very end here to try to prevent that from happening. We met with Russia, we engaged with Russia, but they continued with their plans and ultimately invaded Ukraine on the 24th, or re-invaded, I guess. Expanded the invasion is probably a better way to put it. The reality is that we've also been monitoring and preparing for this since 2014, when Russia invaded and illegally annexed Crimea. And that's the reason why we've increased our presence in the eastern part of the alliance, why NATO allies have started to invest more in defense, and why we've increased our readiness. And it's also why NATO allies provided training and mentorship and other assistance to Ukraine over that same period of time. Allies agreed during last month's Madrid summit to stand in strong solidarity with Ukraine, and that our support will last for as long as it takes. The allies agreed a comprehensive assistance package, which has got a total value now in the hundreds of millions of euros, includes more secure communications, food and fuel, medical supplies, body armor, countermine capabilities, CBRN defense, portable anti-drone systems, and other things. This also builds on years of NATO training and support to Ukraine and substantial military aid from allies. You know, as I said, we don't see any signs that the war will end soon. And in fact, sadly, there are even more signs that this war will be a very long one. And I think we're all very clear-eyed about that. And again, that's why allied heads of government agreed to that comprehensive assistance package through frequent consultation and also a long-term commitment. So the final part of your question, in terms of Putin miscalculating or underestimating the strength of NATO, I actually don't believe he underestimated NATO's physical military strength or our military capabilities. But what he clearly vastly underestimated was the strength of transatlantic unity and alliance solidarity, and also NATO's ability to rapidly reinforce militarily on our eastern flank. I think a lot of the intelligence disclosures were also things that he did not think would happen. And I do think that's had an effect on Putin's decision-making and on the options that the Russians had available to them. But overall, again, I think one of the most important things is that the democracies of the world have united in a way that I don't think that he foresaw. And certainly he also underestimated the Ukrainian people and their government.
Hey, lots of things to talk about there. One thing I wanted to touch on, you had mentioned earlier the 30 nations that comprise NATO. I know it's soon to grow to 32 when Finland and Sweden are their membership is finally ratified. I wanted to ask you about this and you know, your assessment of how the addition of Finland and Sweden, you know, will both affect the alliance and also you know, the message that gives to Russia and how that affects the power balance in Europe.
Yeah, thanks, John. So again, you know, Finland and Sweden joining NATO is very important for Finland and Sweden. It's also really important in NATO, and particularly the Baltic countries, because like if you just look at the map, I think it's easy to understand that that's going to change the whole security situation in the Baltic region, the Nordics as a group, and also help us quite a bit in the high north. Finland and Sweden will really strengthen our presence in that part of the world and in Europe generally. They bring advanced, well-developed, well-equipped military forces with fifth-generation aircraft, other advanced weapon systems, high-tech, and very stable, strong political institutions. I tell you, again, from my vantage point, they also bring a tremendous amount of intelligence and security capability. Allied forces are already fully interoperable with Finland and Sweden. They've trained, exercised, and served together with us for many years. They share the alliance's values, and we all face the same challenges in the Baltic Sea region and beyond. So overall, this is really going to reinforce and strengthen NATO, and will also strengthen Finland and Sweden. I think it's important here to highlight as well that it also sends a very clear message to Putin, and that is that NATO's door is open. You have to remember that in December last year, Putin put forward these so-called security treaties to be signed with NATO. And one of the most important messages from the Russians at that time was that Putin was against any further NATO enlargement, actually wanted less NATO and less NATO capability. And now Putin, in fact, has more NATO on his immediate borders. So what he's actually achieved for this is the opposite of what they demanded at that time. So we didn't close our doors. We may, in fact, we're looking forward to welcoming these two allies after ratification is complete. And through that, we demonstrated that NATO's doors are open, and also that there's a strong will among allies to get Finland and Sweden's accession ratified as soon as possible. But I can't promise anything on behalf of those 30 parliaments, so we just have to see what happens in the next months.
Sure. You mentioned the Baltics a couple times in that response, which makes me think of Estonia, which makes me think of Russia and its cyber actions. And so let's look at the cyber question a little bit. And I wanted to ask you, what can you tell us about how Russia has used its cyber capabilities? And then the response by Ukraine, by NATO, and other partners. We also did get a question here from officials from the government of Estonia asking about, if you can provide any preliminary conclusions on Russian cyber activities before or after the invasion.
Yeah, so I think this is a good question for me to just remind everybody that I'm not sharing any classified information, and I'm basing my answers on open evidence and open analysis. I think I also need to remind here, because we're on the record, that NATO has not publicly attributed cyber operations to Russia in Ukraine. So I'm speaking again based on these private sector assessments and other public information. So based on that open source evidence and analysis, there seems to be a really strong indication that Russia has employed a coordinated cyber campaign intended to provide its forces with an early advantage during the war in Ukraine. On the day the invasion began, for example, Russian cyber units probably successfully deployed more destructive malware, including against conventional military targets such as civilian communications infrastructure and military command and control centers. In the hours before the invasion, a number of important targets in Ukraine were hit. For example, rendering computer systems in multiple government, military, and critical infrastructure sectors inoperable. And we also saw cyber-related sabotage knocking offline the satellite internet provider KSAT, which Ukraine's military intelligence and police units depended upon. Now, these cyber attacks probably also suggest some methodical preparations, with the attackers likely gaining access to Ukrainian networks probably months ahead of the invasion. So one thing I'd call out as a potential lesson is that if all that's true, then that stands in some contrast to the evident lack of preparation across Moscow's other military instruments, including what we see in the ground, in the air, and in other frequently used influence operations like media and social media. But I think it's also true that the Russian military doesn't seem to have coordinated cyber well, if they did at all, with any of their conventional operations. And it's also questionable, if they used cyber in this way, whether they took much advantage of the cyber operations as a result. So, I've co-authored an article on this that ran in Foreign Affairs in the spring to try to contribute a little bit to this debate about did they or didn't they. I come down on the side of they did, but I think it's questionable, as I ended my answer to you, on how effective it was. But I think finally, to the question from our Estonian friend, I think another point to make is I think it's too early to draw a broad range of conclusions about what Russia was and was not able to do in the war at this point, because it's still not over.
Okay. Well, you thinking about cyber a little bit makes me think about cyber threat sharing. Can you talk a little bit about how the NATO partners are doing in that area, being able to quickly share cyber threat information with each other to help bolster cyber defenses and perhaps take measures when there are cyber attacks?
Yeah, this is probably an area where I should be brief and just say that allies have recognized that cyberspace is contested at all times, and that cyber defense underpins and enables our broader deterrence and defense posture. So also in all these ministerials we've had and at the Madrid summit, allies really have taken a series of important decisions to strengthen our cyber defense posture. So we're taking a look at further enhancing cyber resilience, including by building capabilities to help each other respond to malicious cyber activities. Also, and very notable, allies agreed to build and exercise an unprecedented virtual rapid response cyber capability. And through that, relatedly, to expand partnership with the private sector to better defend against malicious cyber activities. And all this is led by allies on a voluntary basis using their national assets. So the Alliance is currently developing a concept to address the types of capabilities and support that will be encompassed in this cyber rapid response effort. So it'd be brief, but a lot in the answer. So I just emphasize that there's always ongoing information exchange between allies about intelligence and security matters, and cyber included.
Okay. You mentioned a little bit about sharing of cyber threat information. Let's talk more broadly now about sharing intelligence information. At the top of our conversation, you had discussed, before the Russian invasion, some of the intelligence that had been shared between allies. And I wanted to ask you more about that, if you could say some more, especially about the intelligence that the United States shared and released about Russia's plans and intentions. How did that help to shape the situation, and how did you engage the U.S. on this sharing issue?
Okay, we seem to be back. Can you hear me now?
Yes. I'm sorry, had you dropped off?
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm back now. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you fine, David. Did you hear my question about intelligence sharing?
He's talking, but
David, it appears that you may not be able to hear me right now. And so we'll see. We'll see if
okay,
you can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you fine. Let me see.
Okay, so
let me see if I can send you a chat.
okay, I can hear you, John. There's just a long delay in the in your speaking and my response to you.
Okay, well then I had asked you to comment some about sharing intelligence information, David, especially before the Russian invasion. The US, as you know, shared detailed intelligence about Russia's plans and intentions. Can you talk some about that and the other sharing that's ongoing, and how you've been able to engage with the US and other partners on intelligence sharing related to Russia?
Yeah, sure. So intelligence sharing was certainly stepped up in the months that preceded the invasion. And this was also formalized in a series of ministerials and leaders meetings in Brussels in March, particularly with regards to improving our shared situational awareness of cyber threats and other issues related to this potential invasion that then became the invasion. Intelligence is really critical to the alliance. It's really important to alliance decision making, and it's also very important to the alliance to understand what's happening in all the regions of concern and across all key issues. And it's really important because the alliance makes decisions, as I've said already, at 30 members of NATO right now, and they have to achieve consensus. So intelligence is a key component of that decision-making process as they assess the environment, the situation, deliberate, and then ultimately take these decisions together. But at the end of the day, it's important to point out that it's the nations themselves and their intelligence agencies that choose to share their information. I'm not the boss of the nation's intelligence services. It's not for me to demand. I can request, they can choose to respond, they can choose on their own initiative to contribute. And as I say, it is certainly stepped up. It is very robust. The services can see that intelligence sharing helped bring governments to the same page with regard to the awareness of the threat from Russia in the run-up to the war, and really did help build solidarity in the decision-making process and to sustain it after the invasion. So overall, I expect that this cooperation will only increase. It's really underlined the vital role that intelligence and security play within NATO, particularly through the division here. But I just point out that it's really the strength and diversity of the 30 nations and their approximately 75 intelligence services that make the difference in this space. They help us protect all the information. They contribute the personnel and the information, the intelligence data that comes into the alliance. So it's them that actually deliver in this space. And I think what you've seen and heard from us is the power that 30 nations with 75 intelligence services have when they work in concert with each other in this way.
Thanks. And on top of the intelligence that each nation is obtaining and then sharing, on top of that, we have had a remarkable amount of publicly available information related to the war in Ukraine, from commercial imagery to citizen intelligence analysis of videos of destroyed equipment and such. I wanted to ask you, how is NATO using this information? And we also have a question from one of our colleagues at Babel Street, Mark Quantick, who asked, can you talk about how NATO leverages open source intelligence and what gaps remain where you might need companies to come in and help?
Yeah, again, thanks, John. So look, all intelligence organizations take advantage of a wide scope of open source information, and we at NATO are no different in that regard. I'm not going to go into particular sources and methods, but I think it's really clear that commercial satellite imagery and videos from the ground in Ukraine and elsewhere have provided significant information and raised awareness among both allied publics and within NATO governments. Going forward, NATO is committed to expanding partnerships with the private sector and any of the others. In some ways, it's made our job easier, as we don't have to engage in hard decisions over what to release and emphasize when the information is already clearly out there. But that said, we're also very careful, and I think the press and the public should be as well, because in these things that are available in open source, I think we have as high, if not an even higher burden for verification and substantiation of that information that we gain from individual citizens or through crowdsourced investigations. And to Mark's question, look, it's really funny he brings this up, because I know this is an area where he works and he and I have had some interactions. NATO headquarters has actually just put out a request for open source intelligence tools from industry. And again, I can't go too deeply into sources and methods, but it goes without saying that OSINT is a very important resource for us at NATO and for the entire alliance intelligence community. So I'm really excited that that request for proposals is out there. And I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues to go through the responses so we can figure out what NATO can benefit from.
Great. That leads me to think about the NATO pledge by many of its members to increase defense spending and increase their budgets and their contributions, perhaps to NATO. Where is NATO as an organization? What are its highest priority intelligence needs? You just mentioned open source intelligence. Are there other intelligence capabilities as well that are of interest to NATO that they would like to work with companies to obtain?
Yeah, again, thanks, John. Look, some allies categorize defense and intelligence spending differently, and I'm not going to comment on any individual ally spending, but I think we've seen that many NATO nations are committing to large spending increases across their national defense and intelligence structures. I think to your question, it's also important to point out, I think a little difference I have with the question, because the increased spending is not solely a reflection of the threat that Russia poses in Russia's war in Ukraine, but even more so about NATO's agreed strategic concept. And a level of ambition that the alliance has just agreed. I want to give you some policy stats on the Wales Pledge across European allies and Canada. We now have 9 allies at or above the 2% Wales commitment. 10 allies have pledged to reach it by 2024 and have solid plans to do so. And 7 more allies have concrete plans to reach the 2% commitment thereafter. And I think it's also important to highlight to the audience that the leaders agreed in Madrid that the 2% Wales Pledge is a floor and not a ceiling on where their national defense spending needs to be. Within NATO, we've also seen allies agree to an increase in our common funded budget. So that means you'll see an increase in finances for facilities, increased training, exercises, command and control, and also partner engagement. Our existing lines of effort that were mandated with the establishment of my division. We have a vision and a strategy. It's very much about the operational performance of the NATO intelligence enterprise, which my division is part. And so there are a number of initiatives we have there. I think I just end my answer to you on this question by pointing out that in addition to open source and other related tools, NATO also has the AGS, our unmanned aerial system, has a radar sensor on it. There will be continued development and maturation of that system, potentially modernization, expansion, new capabilities brought into that over the future. NATO also has an AWACS fleet that likely will be modernized in the coming years. So that's another area that I with and security are really in this category. But one final thing in here that's a big issue for us as well is AI, machine learning, big data exploitation. So I think that's another area where you're going to see the Alliance try to innovate in collectively.
Great. Let me ask you one more question, then we'll get to some audience questions, and there's a whole bunch of them. And this is related to counterintelligence. Over the years, NATO has had a number of counterintelligence incidents, and so Russia, of course, is a significant counterintelligence threat. How is NATO working right now to manage the counterintelligence threats posed by Russia and other hostile nations?
Yeah, first and foremost, it's important to state right up front that security is and has always been a top priority for NATO. And counterintelligence is a security issue, plain and simple, within that. Just like I can't with sources and methods, I'm not going to go into our operational workings. But security is a core part of our division's responsibility. We are joint military and civilian. We're also joint intelligence and security. When we stood up the division in 2016, not only the intelligence structures were combined, we also brought the NATO Office of Security into the new division. That office existed independently for decades beforehand and had tremendous effort focused on counterintelligence and other aspects of security. They're responsible for the intelligence threats to NATO, particularly to its intelligence, to all of its personnel and infrastructure. And they also provide counterintelligence expertise to individuals. You've also seen that a number of allies in recent months and years have taken action against intelligence threats posed intelligence.
For the audience, you've been noticing a lag in some of David's comments.
I can hear you again now.
Okay. Great. Well, let's hop in. Thanks for that. Let's hop into another question from the audience. And we do have one here from Charlie Allen. And Charlie asked another question about intelligence exchange. And he says, can you describe the level of intelligence exchange among NATO countries and delineate where problems may exist?
Especially in an open forum. Look, I've already said that the intelligence sharing is essential, and it's robust, and it continues to grow. We get more and more contributions from allies on any of a range of issues. I think that the thing that we need to consider is that there is a lot of diversity across all the services and across all the nations. So when you think about contributions that can come in, they're not all going to be of the same type and kind. Some need to be translated as well into English and or French, or from French into English, and so on. And that's a factor for us. There have been a number of additional domains that NATO has declared of significant interest in recent years, like cyber and hybrid and space. So these are all areas where we then correspondingly need to grow capability among the services to have these good dialogues and exchanges. And another issue I would highlight to you from the strategic concept, in fact, is the inclusion of China as a challenge to the international security architecture. And so that's yet another new area, and one, frankly, of significant priority, where you should expect that allies will also increase their discussions amongst each other and correspondingly then.
Thank you. In fact, we do have a number of questions about
intelligence
China.
Contributions. So I think the best indicator I can give you is the strength of the consensus in this, because again, that's enabled by a lot of the intelligence sharing and analysis. And again, also just put in a plug for the strategic concept. If you haven't read it, I think it's worth taking a close look at, because it's going to give you some very clear indicators of where the alliance intends to go, and then in our business, what topics will be of the highest concern.
Okay. Here's a question from Jeff Selden, who says, he comments, a number of reports warn that Russia is specifically focusing on what the Kremlin sees as weak links in NATO and the West alliance supporting Ukraine. What is your assessment as far as Russia's influence operations, and how worried are you about both the short and long-term impacts of these Russian efforts?
Well, let me also here put in a plug for the NATO website, because we have a tremendous amount of resources on there about NATO's focus on hybrid. And this is, I think, is the broader area where you'll see us discuss a lot of the Russian influence operations and other malign activities all within this area. So influence operations, cyber in this, as well as use of military, paramilitary capability as well within a lower visibility or even a non-attributed perspective. So it is a great concern. We try to do a lot with strategic communications in this space. We tell the truth, we put out the NATO message. We don't go line by line through various statements to try to debunk them, but we do have a focused effort on combating mis and disinformation. And again, these are things that you'll see on the website. I think fundamentally, I mean, why do we care? We care, I think, first and foremost, because that sort of behavior really conflicts with our values within the alliance, and also our individual national values, because these influence operations can cause violence. They can overthrow governments. They can cause all kinds of problems within individual nations and within the alliance framework that actually do erode, if not steal, individual human rights, to things like self-determination and the decision-making within the individual country. So we've put, as I said, a lot of effort in on this. We also have the NATO Stratcom Center of Excellence in Riga in Latvia that plays a key role in helping us combat and map Russian disinformation. And this is an area where we also coordinate very closely with the EU, because within the EEAS, they also have a focused team center, a lot of resources, and a toolkit as well on their side, focused on combating disinformation and disinformation narratives. So this is a space that I think is really important to take a hard look at. And for what it's worth, there's a short 2-3 minute experts video from me on the NATO website talking about what we're trying to do in the combating hybrids.
Great. Here's another question for you, David. This is from Henry Pollard.
Space, and in that I touch a little bit more deeply than I have here on combating disinformation.
Okay. Thanks. Let's move on to the next question. It's from Henry Pollard from Aberdeen, Maryland, and he asked a question related to electronic warfare. And he wants to know, are there any specific threats that Russia poses to US and NATO partners in the area of electronic warfare?
Yeah, look, there are a lot of potential threats that Russia could pose to us in the electronic warfare domain. They've had, even all the way back in the Soviet era, quite a specific effort focused on electromagnetic spectrum dominance and on radio and electronic warfare. And we did see significant Russian efforts to try to establish dominance in the electronic warfare domain in Ukraine during the first months of the invasion. And certainly they're going to continue to focus on developing these capabilities. So we also need to keep paying attention to these threats.
Thank you for that. Another question is from Tony Capaccio with Bloomberg. Tony asked if you can comment on the level of detail, including ISR information, that NATO is providing Ukraine about Russian troop and artillery dispositions in the Donbass.
Yeah, sorry, that's a question I can't address in a public forum.
Okay. Thanks for your, candidly, not just dodging it with a lot of easy stuff. So here's another question for you from Frederick Barron, who's he says, thank you for your presentation. Is there consensus among NATO allies on what intelligence is, particularly with respect to some of the boundaries you've been discussing, like cyber threats, open source information, commercially available information, etc.?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and hello to Frederick Barron. I don't see many differences between allies, and the differences that exist, I think, are more doctrinal and definitional about different forms of intelligence. But at the end of the day, I think we're all on the same page about what intelligence is and is not. I think in my parlance here this last 2 years, I've learned that I think we really call it more when we speak to audiences more red picture versus white picture for information and blue picture for own force. And within red picture, I think allies understand what the intelligence is that fits in that space. They also appreciate that intelligence is not just data. Intelligence needs to be handled and protected differently, and there's a lot of additional decision making and decision makers involved in intelligence sharing and the protection of intelligence than there might be more broadly with data, even if data that's not intelligence can also be considered sensitive. To the part of the question about weighing release, or other use of intelligence versus protecting national sources and methods, look, it's not going to surprise you that I deal with all the same sets of issues here. On the alliance level, but I think what makes it even more complicated, again, is it's 30 nations and 75 services. So while there is a policy understanding, we have policy, we have procedures, we have practices in this space, it's important for me and my staff here to really understand the views of those individual allies and services, what sections, what their willingness is to share on any given issue at any given time, and then to be able to work with them when it's relevant and important to have that information exchange. But also understand that the decisions on release are made by the nations and their intelligence services, period. We follow the same concepts that I think all services do related to originator control and also to protections of sources and methods. And I know that this audience in particular certainly understands the risks of disclosure that then attach to all of that. So back to you, John.
Thanks. We have time for maybe one or two more questions here. And as you've seen in the news, David, Russia and Iran are starting to increase their interaction and discussions. And so there's a question that asks, how concerned is NATO about Russia's current outreach to Iran and its efforts in particular to acquire drones from Iran to deploy in Ukraine?
Yeah, so John, I've heard the question, but the audio is starting to, it faded in and out a little bit. But first, let me say this is another area where I can't go too deeply, just given the sensitivity of the question and the related information. But I think what I'd emphasize to this audience is that we should expect to seek to circumvent any restrictions upon itself to ensure that it can sustain its war effort, and then also continue to develop and eventually rebuild capabilities that Russia judges it needs for its own military and other uses. So we should not be surprised. We hear about things such as that have been disclosed here about the potential for Russia to be looking to other nations for key technologies. They've thrown just about everything they possibly can against Ukraine so far, and you've all seen the information and the assessments that they continue to lack, key capabilities and facing lowering numbers of some of the key capabilities that they need for the war effort. So this is an area that we'll have to look at in the context of sanctions maintenance. We'll also have to take a look at it in terms of what Russia seeks to do and what capabilities it considers to be most important moving forward on this battlefield and in the future after the war hopefully ends.
Thank you. Well, your last question asks you for a little bit more on the personal side, David, and that is looking back at your experiences in the U.S. intelligence community, from naval intelligence earlier in your career through all of the positions you've held at DIA and White House and ODNI and other roles. How have all of that experience helped you to approach this current position you are in NATO and your role in NATO? And what have you learned, or have you had a change of mindset, or given your work in the year plus now, or maybe it's closer to 2 years that you've been in your current job?
Yeah, thanks. It's actually close to 2.5 years.
2.5.
It doesn't feel like that long because we had COVID in the middle of it. Yeah, I feel like I'm on my third iteration of the job, to be honest, at this point. Look, as you said, I began my intelligence career as a Navy lieutenant when I did my short tour at the Office of Naval Intelligence, and I can't tell you how much of a foundational experience that was for me as I began my career. I worked in an office that's fairly unique called SPEAR at ONI. SPEAR was created to bring naval aviators and me as the one token surface warfare officer into the mix in order to really translate more highly sensitive intelligence information and assessments into something that the fleet, especially the operational fleet, could use more easily for them as they did air-to-air missions and air-to-surface missions and as air defenders. Council. Went to the Joint Staff to be the deputy and the acting J2 under Admiral Mike Rogers. From there to DIA to be the CT chief there. And then from there to the DNI again to be the National Intelligence Manager for the Near East. To the White House briefly, back to the ODNI, chair of the National Intelligence Management Council, and now here. I can't tell you how much I have benefited from all of those people I worked with and for. I can't tell you how fortunate I am to have worked with so many people that I've learned over that period of time. It's really taught me things about military intelligence and civilian intelligence capabilities. It's taught me a whole lot about the way that professionals in our business should do work and the way they should carry themselves, and really about the critical role that intelligence and security plays to inform, advise, to sustain effective decision-making, and to protect all those things. I'm sure I don't get everything right, and I continue to learn lessons every day, but I can't tell you how proud I am to be here as an American senior intelligence and security official, and also as the head, the senior most intelligence and security along. But I would sincerely tell you, it really all did begin with my first exposure to intelligence. Did it come through?
Yes. I think, yes, you've been breaking up a little bit, David, but I want to go ahead and say thank you so much for joining us today and for your comments and your thoughtful insights on all the issues facing. And for everyone who watched online today, thank you for taking time to join us. When the webinar ends, there will be a short survey that pops up. Please take a moment to complete it and let us know how we did. A couple of items I wanted to mention looking ahead. On Tuesday, August the 16th, we're looking forward to holding a leadership dinner for the new NGA director, Admiral Trey Whitworth, at the Arlington Renaissance Capitol View Hotel. Admiral Whitworth will discuss NGA's recently released 2022 technology focus areas, engaging commercial space capabilities, industrial partnership, and more. Also, I wanted to let you know on August the 23rd, we will host DIA Chief Information Officer Doug Casa for a Coffee and Conversation program. And we'll have a chance to hear from Doug on JWIC's modernization efforts, Zero Trust on classified and unclassified networks, cloud computing, and of course, audience Q&A. And then I wanted to mention on September 15th and 16th, we will be holding our in-person Intelligence and National Security Summit in partnership with AFCEA International. We have an incredible lineup of speakers who've already confirmed their participation in sessions. Topics include Chinese threats to US supply chains, commercial space, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, midterm election security, and more. Early registration goes through the end of this week. It will end on July 22nd. Please visit intelsummit.org for registration details. You can learn more about all of INSA's programs and activities on our website, insaonline.org. This concludes this morning's program. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful day.